saying here now, like Gary is London based, so I agree with him perfectly. So where it is already modified, it's a little challenging to restore back. So we just put it in the modified category of habitat. So the same thing goes to the natural habitats, just like Collins was mentioning here. So keep your comments coming. While we see how to round off on this as soon as we can and move on to conclude it. Somebody said, how do I undertake the risks and impact identification process? Well, it's a systematic process that has to be planned. It's not, well, there are a lot of materials, but the risks identification process, you have to take a look at all the aspects of risk identification and impact identification, from social angle, from health angle, from biodiversity angle, from air quality angle, from several angles and components of the environment. So including hydrological angle, hydrological aspects. So it's a comprehensive procedure, but actually worth it because you get to resolve so many issues in this. Even the preliminary risk assessment procedure that can be done desktop based on factors, based on baseline information available, it can be useful. Okay. So, but comprehensive risks and impact identification process is what we are discussing in this context. So if you send me an email, I will send you a procedural guideline, which is also available online, but I can send it to you since I have a copy. I can email it to you. So you can send an email to info@richflood.com and you'll certainly get a response with regards to risks and impact identification process. So we will just dive straight into legally protected, our different types of habitats that we have been discussing. I'll dive into it now so that we can make some progress very quickly and round up in the next 10 minutes if possible. Okay. So, we discussed the modified habitat, the natural habitat. We discussed all of this. Recall that we say the modified habitat of non-native origin. It means that it is not of a native origin, and it means that human activity have substantially modified the habitat. We also talked about the natural habitat. This one is where human activity has not essentially modified an area's primary ecological function or the species compositions. Okay, that's what we discussed at that time. So we also looked at the critical habitat, which I said I call it the critically critical habitat because of the high biodiversity value that the critical habitat is having. So in rounding up, we'll just go to the legally protected and internationally recognized areas. These are areas, as the name implies, that are within legally protected area. The proponents will have to meet the requirements that captures these aspects of biodiversity. If it's of internationally recognized area, the international relevant laws will have to be taken into account in the process of assessment. So it has to be legally permitted before such a proposed project or proposed development can be sited in such areas. So it's actually a very, very sensitive habitat. because there must be consideration on government management plans, or it can be local or international regulations kind of management plan for such areas. So, and there will have to be some intense consultations with protected area sponsors or the managers of the protected areas, the affected communities there, the indigenous people there, and other stakeholders on the proposed project. So it's more diplomatic in nature. So additional programs, remember we captured management programs the other time. So additional programs will, as appropriate, we have to be considered to promote the conservation aims and effective management of such areas. Okay, so we go to invasive alien species. Okay, so intentional or accidental introduction of alien or non-native species of either flora or fauna into areas where they are not normally found can be a significant threat to biodiversity, since some of these alien species can become invasive, spreading rapidly and outcompeting the native species. So this is a concern. So the proponents will intentionally introduce measures, or in other words, will not introduce this alien species unless it is carried out in accordance with the existing regulatory framework for such introduction. It can be local regulatory framework or international regulatory framework. So whatever it is, the proponent should not deliberately introduce alien species with a high-risk invasive behavior, regardless of whether such introductions are permitted under local or international regulatory framework. All introductions of alien species is supposed to be subject to risk assessments to determine the potential for invasive behavior for this by this species. So the proponent will implement measures to avoid the potential for accidental introductions or unintended introductions. And when they're intended, it has to be controlled, because sometimes there are introductions of species based on the project demands, so it has to be really controlled, and detailed studies done and management plans or management programs to capture that should be taken care of in details. So where they are already established, where the alien species are already established in the local community or in the country, the proponent will exercise the due diligence that is needed in not spreading them into areas in which they have not already been established. So the proponent should take measures, to eradicate such species from the natural habitats over which they have been controlled. Okay, so we go further to our next point here, which is sustainable management of living natural resources. Sustainable management of living natural resources. And then we talk about the supply chains, which can be, we have primary supply chains, and so on and so forth. So clients are engaged, in most times in the primary production of living natural resources, including natural and plantation forestry, sometimes agriculture, animal husbandry, aquaculture, and fisheries. Will locate land-based agribusiness and forestry projects on unforested land. Excuse me, please. Okay. So there are standards for sustainable management of living natural resources, and the standards are objective and achievable, and the proponents have to recognize the standards, and the standards are founded on a multi-stakeholder consultations. Okay, so this point I'm making is that credible, globally recognized standards for sustainable management of living natural resources are those that have to be objective and achievable. They are those that are founded on intense consultations or consultative procedures, are those that are founded on a multi-stakeholder consultative procedures, and also are those that encourage stepwise and continual improvements on a sustainable basis. Okay, so where relevant and credible standards exist, the proponent has maybe the proponent has not yet obtained the independent verification or certification required, then the proponent will conduct some assessments, or let me say pre-assessments of its conformity to the applicable standard, and take actions to achieve such verification or certification over an appropriate period of time. Okay, so for the supply chain, primary suppliers, these are suppliers actually who on an ongoing basis provide the majority of living natural resources, goods and materials essential for the core business processes of the project. So where a proponent is purchasing primary production that is known to be produced in regions where there is a risk of significant conversion of natural or critical habitats, system and verification practices, it will have to be adopted as part of the environmental and social management system, to evaluate the primary suppliers, like I initially defined. So the systems and the verification practices will identify where the supplier is coming from and the habitat type of this area where it is coming from, to identify or provide for an ongoing review of the proponent's primary supply chains. It will limit procurement to those supplies that can demonstrate that they are not contributing to significant conversion of natural or critical habitats, and so on. So where possible, to require actions to shift the proponent's primary supply chain over time to suppliers that can demonstrate that they are not significantly adversely impacting these areas. Okay, so the ability of the proponent to fully understand these risks will depend on the proponent's level of management control or influence over its primary supplier. Okay, so well, I would have loved to show us a sample of ESMS capturing the biodiversity conservation and management of the living natural resources. It's in a video format. I will just try to see if it's going to play. It's pre-recorded at the Richflood Learning Center. Let me see if it can play. If not, we will have to draw the curtain at this point. Still trying. So I can see your questions are coming in. These are very interesting questions. I will read them one after the other. I can see also some persons are providing answers to them already, which is impressive. It's very impressive. I can see answers have been provided. So let me see the video. Well, while it's still trying to play, based on the risks and impact identification process that we have discussed earlier, the requirement for this particular subject apply to projects in modified areas. Remember the slide we have here? They are applied to projects in modified habitats, natural and critical habitats. They are also applied to projects that potentially impact or depend on ecosystem services, over which the proponent has direct management control or management or significant influence, over. So that's okay. The video is not coming up, so let me take on the questions and the answers. They are quite interesting. So I will take on the answers. Excuse me. While we round off, so you can reach us at info@richflood.com. I can see some very serious questions coming up that will really take some time to dissect. So if you send a message to info@richflood.com based on your project that you mentioned that is in Kenya, this your project in Kenya, we can discuss it. If you send an email, we can do some free consultations for you so that we can put you on the right path in terms of the ESDD you mentioned. Okay, so let's take the questions now and see how